Starseed Showdown, experience the unknown.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Starseed Showdown. Today, we're going to have a discussion with Bruce Fenton. He's the author of several books, Exogenesis, Hybrid Humans, Into Africa, and he's had appearances on the Science Channel and the History Channel. So obviously, well-researched, well-spoken. We're looking forward to talking today. So Bruce, how are you doing?
Thanks very much for having me on. Yeah, I'm doing very well. Looking forward to talking through some of the topics that you've highlighted. And yeah, hopefully it will be something for everyone. You know, we can cover quite a bit. So hopefully, yeah, we'll engage some minds into considering things that perhaps they haven't in the past.
Yeah, thanks again for joining us. So to start off with, can you just give us a little bit of your background and how you got into this research of human origins?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I basically got into the kind of research of anomalous phenomena and scientific kind of mysteries quite early on in my teen years, initially just through some collectible cards, which were, I think they were called Unexplained Mysteries of the World. And each one would have something like, you know, the Great Pyramids, the Yeti, Loch Ness Monster. You know, I think like 40 cards, different mysteries. And I think that was the first thing that really got me interested. And then after that, you know, I guess like a lot of people, you know, buying collections of mysteries type books. And, you know, it just sort of blossomed from there, became a bit more serious, started to kind of dig deeper into particularly ancient mysteries, you know, anything kind of unanswered in our deep past. And then I think the way these topics were, you know, expanded out into the paranormal, aliens, UFOs, and gradually over time, I think you find that all of these topics have, at the very least, have kind of connectivity. And certainly in terms of the communities that are interested, you tend to find there's a lot of overlap. So it's eventually expanded into a fairly wide range of subjects. And again, I would put them all under anomalous phenomena, kind of loosely, like anomalous phenomena and ancient mysteries. I think would probably cover what I do. Of course, yeah, I'd say I got more seriously involved probably from my mid-20s onwards. Traveled to various ancient sites around the world, to Mexico, to the Mayan sites, to I've been to Australia, to some of the interesting places there, like the glyphs at Gosford, and to some other kind of sacred sites out there, as well as Egypt, of course. I've been fortunate to go to Egypt, out into the Giza Plateau and into areas that aren't really normally accessible for tourists. And well, so I've been basically to 6 of the 7 continents. So I've been to sort of the Khmer temples in Cambodia, down to, of course, sites in the UK, across, as we talked earlier, you know, Stonehenge, all the kind of classic sites. And also where I live in Gloucestershire, there's a lot of ancient sites that aren't as well known, but we have, you know, barrows and standing stones and stuff here as well. So, you know, yeah, so on each of the continents, except for Antarctica, you know, I've been to some mysterious site or another. And I lived in Ecuador for 5 years, so I was fortunate to explore a megalithic site in the jungle there, in the Amazon jungle, which was kind of crazy, and we can touch on that later perhaps. And that ended up getting into I think it was in the Telegraph and a couple of newspapers, because it's in an area where there shouldn't be any civilization, basically. So we had that, and so I've done all kinds of wanderings to ancient places. But then, yeah, conversely, I've taken a deep dive into human origins, which has become probably my central focus now. And that began in around about 2013, and I started exploring the backstory to the early habitation of the Americas in connection to the sites in Ecuador that I was involved with. And what I found was that there was a kind of a mystery there as to these people who first arrived in the Americas around 50,000 years ago down in Brazil, what they call the Lagoa Santa. And that kind of dovetailed out into a rethinking of recent out of Africa and the early migrations, and then even further back into beginnings of Homo sapiens, and then with a twist where I got involved with some information that suggested an alien intervention. And then so that took me sort of even further back, and with a new level of controversial evidence that suggests that this story is not only somewhat confused and obscured and misrepresented to us, but also has this cosmic layer to it. So it's kind of spiraled out over these years, but it's particularly headed down this human origins pathway.
Yeah, thanks. That's super interesting. I think that megalithic exploration of those sites is a really good background to what you do. And that's a super important work, I think, because humanity is trying to like explore itself and what it is and where it came from. And I think so much has been hidden from us that like I think your work is super important, And it's guys like you that are going to start leading us down paths and rabbit holes that will unveil the truth. And so, what have you uncovered? I know you've written a few books, and I haven't unfortunately read any yet, but I do want to get a few of them. And what exactly is the strongest evidence to lead you to believe that we have a past that's entwined with extraterrestrials, or that something is not quite right about our mainstream explanation of our origins?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of sort of lines of evidence. I mean, one of the first things which I think was important was understanding that the dogma and this kind of holy cow story that we have of our African origins, that was being misrepresented to us, because if anyone looks for the story of Homo sapiens, and particularly of modern humans, it's always stated as fact that we have this African origin. Now, we have to be very careful when we state facts, particularly in an area where the evidence is incomplete and murky, but also where it's changed a lot over the decades. You sort of have these dogmas that stay in place. Sometimes they seem unchanging. And the deeper I kind of looked into this backstory of the early Americans, and they appear to be what's called Australoid. Basically, they were closely related to early Papuans and indigenous Australians, right? And we tell that from the skeletons that have been found, the earliest skeletons, some of the genetic evidence in certain isolated tribes. There's traces of genes that are most closely related to Papuans and indigenous Australians, suggesting that there was an early population in the Americas who had traveled from Oceania, right? And that then the later arrivals from Asia, from East Asia, probably across the land bridge, which we now think which now the conventional scientific narrative is that they probably sailed along the ice, so they basically had boats. And once you infer boats, also that changes a lot of the ways that people can move. But so it's now being recognized that probably these people came in, but they interacted with remnants of an older population, right? So that whole story of the population of America is in flux. So it's like, who were these people? When did they get there? And the evidence is suggesting 50,000 years ago. Now, around 50,000 years ago is also the time that Eurasia is supposedly being populated from East Africa. Now, if anyone looks for the story of recent out of Africa, what you find is a range of dates from around 50,000 to 80,000 years ago, right? There's this kind of vague dating where they say that, you could pull up a dozen articles and find the date different on them, but it always ranges somewhere between 50,000 to 80,000 for a number of reasons. But basically, we know that Eurasia is being populated not long before 50,000 years ago. Okay, so this is kind of strange. So you've got people that are supposedly coming out of East Africa, but not only are they arriving in Europe and Asia, they also seem to be arriving in the Americas. Right, and that's a long hike. So if you've got a slowly expanding population, it's kind of almost like, well, what are they doing in Brazil, perhaps 50,000 or more years ago, right? So there's definitely a huge anomaly there. And then to find that there's this kind of genetic signal that's persisted today, so we know that this is real, this is a genuine population that was there. So this is undermining that story. And so the more I dug into that, I found that there was a range of inconsistencies. And one of the reasons why I'm just going to go through this a bit is because this takes us to Australia, which is important for the alien intervention side of it, which also takes us to Australia. And as we find that, in fact, what happened is you have a lot of evidence pointing to the early hominins, the early ancestors of modern humans, being widespread. So they're all across Africa and Eurasia probably by around about 700,000 years ago. There's evidence of what's called transitional fossils in China from 700,000 years onwards. And those transitionals, i.e. have characteristics of early archaics like Homo erectus and of later Homo sapiens. So you can see a transition is happening in the fossil record. So these people are kind of widespread. They're right across from Africa to Asia. And so then what happens is it seems that there are a number of climatic events which at times cause migrations and also extinctions, contractions of populations, a lot of complexity in movement. Whereas usually you're told, that there's these waves coming out of Africa. In reality, of course, there's nothing stopping people going in and out of Africa, in and out of Asia. And this is reality. People follow pathways which lead them to better climate, to more food, to new mating population. There's a lot of reasons why we move, and not necessarily in one direction, right? Humans will move around in chaotic ways. And so you have, though, these events which would sometimes sever populations or cause major die-offs. And one of these, we know that one happens around 120,000 years ago. There's a climate shift. And it's funny that we find the earliest modern human-type fossils in East Asia are dated to around 120,000 years. They're in cave sites in China. You also find some of these early archaics down in the Mediterranean region and down in Southeast Asia. There's indications of these people very early. And so we've got this population that's very widespread. Now, around about 72,000 years ago, there is a climatic shift. There's the Lake Toba supervolcano. And that causes there's already an ice age, but this causes a dip in the temperatures and also is producing acid rain, clouds, a swirling dust cover of the northern hemisphere. So a climate shift is underway. And we know that basically across the northern hemisphere, you're going to have a major impact. Now, it doesn't mean it's a total extinction, but a major impact. And so this pushes populations into new areas, particularly moving southward. And so if you're in an area where there's a climatic problem and you're moving away from it, there's two areas you can go to. You can go into Africa, and that's across the Bab el-Mandab is the most likely, which is in Yemen. So you can cross into East Africa, and that's where in East Africa we find some of the earliest Homo sapiens, very accepted early modern humans. We find Homo and Herto. And then down in basically Southeast Asia, you've got another climate refuge. So if you're escaping from this climatic shift, if you move down into Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia particularly, Indonesian islands and Oceania, so Australia, Papua, and also down into Southern Africa, so sub-equatorial Africa, these are climate refuges from this disaster that's underway. Now, that just happens to time with the genetic evidence in East Africans of these new lineages, both in the male and female, which have been associated with the early Eurasians who were supposedly coming out of Africa, right? So the inference was because these first Eurasians have these male and female lineages that are very similar to these to a specific East African population, is that they've come from them. But what I argue, and not just myself now, there's some papers that come out about this, is that in fact this is a movement into Africa driven by climate. And so that's why you see both a male and female lineage appearing in Africa, which is really unlikely through mutation, because the mutation rates on these two, on the male and female, are different by a factor of 10. So to get the appearance of a change in those populations that's both in the male and female lineages is extraordinarily unlikely. It's explained far better by an incursion of people going into East Africa. We also see the appearance of arrowheads and some cultural shifts in terms of ochre carvings and stuff. So these are clear indications of people coming in. And we now know as well that the aridity and basically this drought that's sweeping across northern Africa, the Middle East, and in most of Eurasia, as far as we can tell, is going to be a massive barrier for people coming out of Africa. It doesn't make sense. As one climate expert kind of says, it's like the worst time to be moving out of Africa, like leaving sub-equatorial Africa, which is basically completely habitable, and you're going to move north and east into this climate apocalypse, right? So I'm looking at this, I think, well, this doesn't make sense. So clearly we have been given a very warped story. And although the evidence is pointing to something else, it's not changing in our media. It's not changing in those documentaries on Nat Geo, right? That little shifts in the story have occurred, but we are still being told our ancestors, in Eurasia, walked out of Africa 70,000 years ago, or again, as I say, sometimes 50 to 70 to 80. And the reason for that is they're trying to explain that at the genetic level, Eurasian people diverge from other groups at around about 55,000 years ago. So you look at the genomes. Now, that doesn't correspond with that 70,000 year date. And that's why you end up with that range of 50 to 80, because you're looking at two lines of evidence and they don't meet in time, but they are being inferred to come from the same migration event. And that's why you end up with that weird range of 50 to 80, which is a massive range, is because these are two distinct events. So you have people going into Africa at 70,000, but then down in Southeast Asia, as the climate recovered, people move up from Oceania, right, and into East Asia, taking these genes into East Asia. And that's where we have the beginnings of the Eurasian people. So firstly, the East Asians, and then there's a migration towards Europe and North Africa, which occurs about 50,000 years ago. And so you have this populating event, right? So all of that is there in the evidence. So if a fundamental a sort of holy cow theory like that is being misrepresented to us and being told, it's a fact that these ancestors walked out of East Africa, right? And I can show quite provably with all academic peer-reviewed studies that does not fit reality. Then you have a big question mark over, how much can we put trust into these major stories about who we are, where we came from, what is happening in that deep past, right? So instead, it turns out that the best evidence points to Australasia, okay? And another thing we also is relevant here again is that in the last few years, they found sites in Australia. That there's one in the north, which is dated to around 65 to 80,000 years, a cave site. But then down in the south, right down in the southern tip of Australia, there's what's called a shell midden site. So cooked burnt shells that have been stacked. The shell midden site that's 120,000 years old, potentially. Two areas where fire stick farming is believed to occur, the Great Barrier Reef and Lake Victoria, I think it's or Lake George, where 120,000 years ago, someone was deliberately burning. Right. So if people are down there 120,000 years ago, clearly they can't have just walked out of Africa somewhere like 50 to 80. So again, there's something's very wrong in that story. Now, the Aboriginal people down here, obviously in Australia, they say they've always been there and that they're the first people and that everyone came from there, and they have all these legends and stories of that. They also talk about that their ancestors, were essentially created by these special beings in the dream time. And there's, a lot of mythology there, particularly pointing to the Pleiades. And you can find the Pleiades reference across almost all of the distinct nations of Australasia. You'll find that they go back to the Seven Sisters dreaming stories, and that, the Seven Sisters, basically, there's a whole dreaming path that goes across the country where you have these stories about what they did in these different locations, and that there's also a narrative about sort of a conflict between an Orion-linked kind of a narrative with this Pleiades story, that there's some kind of conflict, which is Orion the Hunter and the Seven Sisters. Now, if you think about that as well, the Greeks and the Greeks have this story of the Orion the Hunter and the Seven Sisters. Now, hang on, why would there be a connection, right? Why would there be a connection between ancient Greece and their stories and Aboriginal Australia, considering that in the official narrative, the people down there have been disconnected, have walked down there maybe 50,000 years ago, and have been totally separate from the rest of the world until fairly recently. But yet the ancient Greeks have the same story, right, of this Orion the Hunter chasing the Seven Sisters. So there's we can see there's some issues there. You also will find that down in South America, I think down in Tierra del Fuego, you've got stories that parallel. Actually, no, sorry, in Brazil, you've got stories that parallel Aboriginal law in terms of when they looked up and saw the Great Black Rift in the Milky Way, right? A lot of the indigenous Australians, what they saw was emu lady. There's this emu. You saw it if you look up at the dark rift, there's this emu that stretches across, right? Now, funnily enough, if you go down to parts of Brazil where they found these traces of the genetics, bear in mind that their story is of this, I think it's kind of guinea bird. I can't remember what it's called, but it's a very similar bird. It's the rhea bird, which is basically looks like an emu. And they say stretched across there. And both of them have a story about the Pleiades planting when the Pleiades rises. So you've got, again, you've got these strange coincidences between this early lore down in Australia and other cultures, because the people are coming out of there, right? The early origins of all Eurasians, right, all Americans, go back to Oceania. Now, Africa did have an early human population as well. But the rest of the world has been populated primarily from Oceania. And that's why you get these legends that are corresponding, because these are very old. We know today that, in fact, Aboriginal stories, some go back tens of thousands of years, and that there's another wave of these stories that go out into the world at around 12,000 years, 13,000 years ago, when the sea levels rose and flooded a vast part of Sunda and Sahel, which is the two plates, the Southeast Asian plate and the Oceanic plate, right? So you've got Oceania and Southeast Asia lose this almost a continent-sized wealth of land around the time of the Younger Dryas cataclysms. And so these people, when they migrate, most of them migrating, I would suggest that what they do is they travel by ship. And again, that sounds all controversial, but if you look at the evidence there, down in island Southeast Asia, it's now clear that the people were ocean sea fishing, right, 40,000 years ago. So if they were ocean sea fishing 40,000 years ago, how good were they at sailing by 12,000 years ago? Right. So this is something that people have to think about. Hang on a minute. If you give someone, 20, 30,000 years of getting used to sailing what is the most perilous currents in the world, how good are they at sailing by 12,000 years ago? So this is a maritime culture, right, by then. So when this is flooding, they are migrating. And I would suggest that they move to a few places. One of them is that they sail across to their harbor that they have down in India, the bottom of India, where, off the coast there is a sunken port city, which Graham Hancock famously has dove on and shown images of megalithic structures under the water. Now, that would have been a port city for them, right? And also from there, I believe that some of them traveled to Mesopotamia. They sailed up the Tigris, and they sailed up and founded Göbekli Tepe. Why do I think that? Because if you look at the symbols, and there's a couple of articles I can share if people are interested, showing this, I've written this up, but you can see the symbols on the stones of Göbekli Tepe are mirror images of symbols from northern Australia, from the coastal regions up in Arnhem Land. And you'll find that, for example, on pillar 43, which is the most notable pillar, which shows the bird and the sort of headless figure, and as most people would have probably seen, that is echoed in wall art down in Arnhem Land as the story of Emu Lady and the forbidden fruit. You see that circle next to the bird on pillar 43, which is Emu Lady and the forbidden fruit. Now, there's also other symbols on the stones at Göbekli Tepe that echo what we see down in Arnhem Land. So these are people that are coming up from this lost civilization down in Southeast Asia and taking another wave of this culture out into the world. And that would have been readily acceptable, bearing in mind that the first people have come up from here 45, 50,000 years ago, taking the Oceanian culture with them. So then as another wave of these people come out, the information they bring with them would have no doubt already had correlations with the lore of the people who they were interacting with across Eurasia as they moved out with this new wave of people coming from what was a kind of Atlantis-type civilization. Now, I don't know technologically how far advanced they were, but they would have been very good sailors at the very least and had an ocean traveling kind of culture. So that's a bit of a backstory with why I can see that there's a gaping hole in our origin story and in the way cultures have flowed around the world, the origins of our lore stories of who we are and who we should be looking to for really to be the cauldron of knowledge about who we are and where we came from. We should be looking to these people down in Australasia. And it's funny because in the kind of circles, in the ancient mystery circles, most people look at Egypt, Sumeria, and Native Americans, and traditionally Aboriginal Australians have been passed over a lot. I think that's to do with the fact that for a very long time they were seen as kind of the youngest culture, that they had only arrived down in Australia fairly recently, like 20,000 years ago or so. Now we know that that's absolutely wrong, completely wrong. And so if you start to approach them with respect and look at what information they have, then they not only do they correlate a lot of this, but also this story of interaction with beings that are cosmic in nature and a creation story for us that is very different to the one that we know. I'll pause there for a minute because I can do quite a lot there.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's so many areas to explore because, there's so many factors to human evolution, or like what we are now and how we got here. And I'm thinking more along the lines of, well, first of all, you've clearly laid out, just one really good reason, like that why, the mainstream story of humanity's evolution it's got so many gaps in it. So I really find interesting the theory that humans have been like kind of genetically engineered by these other beings, or we've been planted here. So what I'm thinking is like, well, maybe eventually once we find out more about our own DNA, then it'll clearly lay out a story of how we've been made and where we came from, right? So do you know anything about in that area and genetics or anything?
Yeah, sure, certainly. And so, I'll go on to the other part, which is the alien part. And obviously, I'm just sort of laying out a framework for people to understand that there's an awful lot wrong with this story. And again, if I'm bringing it up, if someone wants to, challenge me or ask me something on that later, or email me, ask me a question for, a link or something, I'm quite happy to do that because, all of that is based on, stuff that anyone can go and look at. But when we come to this part of the story, what happened for me was, I was following up on all of this interweaving, problems in this backstory, but most of it was sort of fairly conventional. But I ended up connecting with a couple of researchers over in Australia called Stephen and Evan Strong, and they had a link with a lady called Valerie Barrow, and she'd written a book about this intervention story. Now, it's a very far out seeming book for anyone that just looks at the conventional story of our origins. There's a lot in there, with all kinds of beings and all sorts of. But at the very core of what happened was, and this is what I find quite fascinating. Once you understand what our cutting edge scientists think about the potential of alien contact and how that might occur, the kind of technologies that they theorize might be involved, and what we should look for in terms of evidence they've been here. And then once you get that, and if you then compare that with the story that she shares, it's quite extraordinary, because what we have is a situation where there's two particularly important people in the story. We have obviously Valerie Barrow, who's a person of English origin, who's an Australian, and then we have Jerry Bostock, who's an Aboriginal elder. He's also a noted filmmaker, storyteller, and healer, who's unfortunately passed on. But he was a highly respected kind of Aboriginal wisdom keeper. And it was a bit of a strange story because he's basically driving along one day. Well, he's in a car with a friend of Valerie's one day, and she mentions to him that she's got a friend who lives nearby in a house called Al Chiringa. And Al Chiringa basically means the kind of the dream time, the creation time, right? So she's chosen this name for her house. And at that time, Valerie has recently come into possession of an artifact called a Chiringa, right? A Chiringa, there's a lot of mythology around Chiringas. They are a hand portable kind of sized object, highly sacred. They normally would be kept, it's almost like a holy of holies, kept away from the group by an elder, often in a cave or somewhere, and only brought out at ritual events. And the basic mythology is that these were left by the Al Chiringa beings, these kind of creation beings who were here in the dream time, and they left some of these Chiringas, the original ones, and that these were sort of alive, that they could communicate, that they had a spirit to them, and that they were, the most important relics, and they would be brought out just for these kind of initiation ceremonies and stuff, and that nobody else would handle them or even uninitiate people, particularly women, weren't even allowed to look on them. They had all this, law around it, which, if you think about it, is awfully similar to the story of the Ark of the Covenant, which someone pointed out to me one day when I was talking about this, that, very similar, that, could only be looked after by the high priest, that people weren't supposed to touch them, they only brought out special times, that they could communicate in some way, and that were left by these gods, that had come down on the mountain, right? So you have a very interesting parallel story that's going on down in Australia, but obviously potentially much, much earlier. And that this artifact is left with Valerie by someone who's trying to get it back to the traditional keepers, which is the tribal nation around Uluru. right? So this person in the process of trying to have this thing repatriated, knowing it's a sacred object that, shouldn't really have ended up in Western hands, but was found, about a century before in a cave by camel traders. So they used to use camels going across the desert to do trade, and someone had taken this object. So the backstory is that apparently as well, it was actually luminous in the cave. It was glowing in the cave. Now, obviously, I can't know way to say if that's true, but that's part of the backstory. So it was a strange object. Shouldn't have ended up in kind of Westerners' hands. Someone was trying to get it back to them. Now, this person was very unwell and had heard that Valerie was kind of an alternative thinker, somebody that, potentially would be open to looking after it. So contacted and said, could you hold on to this for me while I go to hospital and have treatment? And, I've heard you've got a house called Alcharinga, and that, you sound like a person who might be open to that. And so she was like, yeah, fine, you can leave it with me. It was just kept in a box. It was wrapped in paper bark. She didn't touch it, didn't look at it, just in this box. And then she started having a kind of, I don't know if we call it download, but some communication that she had, a strange experience that something began talking to her saying it was called Alcharinga. Now, so this is going on. A couple of days later, a few days later, this elder is passing by, hears about the house and says, do I want to go there? Has this intuition he has to go there. So he turns up at the house. Valerie is kind of aware that this is really strange. She had no interaction really with in the indigenous people, despite living in Australia a long time. She's had no interaction. And suddenly, you've got this elder turns up at your house, shortly after you've received this ancient artifact. You can imagine you're thinking, well, obviously it's connected. So she kind of says to him, well, I've got this thing, but, I haven't touched it and it's just in a box. And, he's a bit sort of flustered and he says, did you want it? So he's like, no. He's quite nervous about it because he understands that these power objects can bring, problems for you, that they are difficult to interact with. That's their understanding in the law. Right. So they have this conversation. He says, what I think you're meant to do is that we take this object and we go down to Gosford, to a sacred site there, which I feel is connected, and we'll meet there in a few days and we'll see what happens, kind of thing. So they do exactly that, and when they're there, they have this kind of time shift kind of experience, they claim, and that they find themselves, instead of seeing the site as it is now, it shifts into as it would have been in the past. There's like kind of tropics, tropical jungle. They can see the coastline from where they are has kind of changed, but they also notice there's a craft. There's a craft hovering over the water, kind of saucer, and another one in the water that's kind of crashed. And they can see there's these beings on the beach, and they can see they're not humans. And then they actually see themselves as being not quite human, that they're humanoids, and they themselves have changed. And so they have this very strange kind of altered perception experience. And during this experience, they also receive a lot of information, saying about this craft that came to our planet hundreds of thousands of years ago. They're aware of this, what it was about, this mission, that it came here to kind of colonize, and that it was destroyed in orbit. And there's this whole long story that they get, right? So all of that, you can think, well, okay, great sci-fi, very wacky or whatever. But, I read this book and felt that there was enough in there to at least test whether or not it was true. And having followed this narrative about the Aboriginal people being the first people and their stories about, interaction with beings from the Pleiades, I was quite intrigued that, the information suggested, particularly involving an elder, suggestive that there was perhaps, enough information to explore whether this was factual and whether or not we could actually prove that this happened. Because there was a few key areas in what these people claimed had happened in terms of this story that could be tested. Now, the first thing was, he said that there was this giant craft that was in orbit around Earth, and it's made of a crystalline material, like a silica. It's a living AI craft, right? So mainly a silica craft. It's alive, so it's got its own sentient AI, and that there are beings on board. But this craft is said to have been destroyed in orbit, and they describe it as almost parts of it melting and raining down, right? So I'm kind of thinking, well, that potentially could be found, because silica, unlike a lot of metals and stuff we would, silica glasses and stuff can persist a very long time, enormous amount of time. Of course, a craft made of any conventional metal or something like that would be eroded away. And then the other parts of this was the assertion that some of the survivors came down, that they were involved in modifying an existing hominin species and giving it boost in terms of evolution to change it and make it somewhat more like them, and to change these existing hominids to make them a kind of upgraded, I suppose we'd call it, and that they did some genetic engineering to these hominids. Well, that can potentially be tested as well. And they also described a third thing that was testable, which was that they said there was a deliberate bombardment of the planet occurs around the same time, 5 years later, by another group of these beings who come, and it's sort of a policing mission. So this original craft has been destroyed in orbit by a group that's already on this planet. Is essentially in control of this planet at that time. So there's a kind of almost a policing action where another group comes, says, we've destroyed a peaceful colony ship. You basically got to get off the planet. If you don't get off the planet, we're going to bombard, and we will bombard with asteroids. So we don't use lasers and stuff. So we just pull in asteroids and bombard planets. So we can crack a planet open if we want to. So it makes our nukes look like pea shooters. Right, so all that's in there, and again, you can say, is it fantasy or not? But I felt that there was enough there to explore and see whether or not this was real. Now, I want to backtrack a little bit, because this Chiringa, it sounded an awful lot to me like what's called a Bracewell Sentinel probe. Now, Bracewell probes are essentially living, AI probes that an alien civilization, or us, if we get advanced enough, could send out into the cosmos to explore instead of biological beings going out, which of course is highly risky, right? But you can send out these AI probes that they will visit a solar system, and that they can then look for signs of life. And you can also have a type that's called sentinel probes, which would sit either on an asteroid monitoring a solar system or on a planetary surface recording, monitoring. And the theory is that a Bracewell probe could be programmed so that if a civilization arises to a certain level on a planet, that the probe makes contact with that civilization and acts as the intermediary between the two species. Right? This is kind of quite genius, because of course then it cuts out this need to communicate across vast distances, because you can have a real-time conversation with the other species via this kind of sentient being inside the probe. Right? So this is something that's theoretical in terms of space science here. But now when you look at these stories, these Aboriginal people are saying that these original beings left these artifacts that are somewhat alive, that can communicate information, and that are, basically, these sacred transmitters of knowledge that they've interacted with. We would recognize that in our sciences as being very much sounding like a Bracewell Sentinel probe. And again, the idea of it making contact and saying to somebody that, there's this lost story that needs to come out is actually, again, weirdly, in a lot of the websites that talk about Bracewell probes, say, what might we get from one of these if we were to interact with it? And they say, well, it might have a complete record of the human story, because if it's been sitting on our planet, it would potentially know all about us, right? So again, whereas this might start out sounding like a very wacky story, this is actually kind of an expectation in terms of the theoretical space sciences, that these are the sort of things we should be looking for, right? So again, that's kind of very, very compelling in itself, that, this is exactly what we should be looking for, artifacts that are left here, silica, living AI artifacts that would have a record of who we are and would be able to communicate on behalf of some other intelligence, right? So we now have a kind of a hand-in-glove fit to what we're told we might expect. And so it's telling us this whole story. And then I thought, well, okay, if there was a bombardment of our planet, and again, the date she kind of got from this was somewhere in this, one instance you mentioned 700,000, another 900,000. And I thought, well, I'll look across from 700 to 900,000, is there a period where we see this stuff happening? So, because I recognize, we're talking about a vast period of time. What it turns out is, if you look for this, round about 780,000 years ago, there is indeed, a bombardment of asteroids that hits our planet. Now, that wasn't well known. When this book came out in 2008 or something like that, it's quite 2003, so a while back. Now, the reason why most people probably haven't heard of that bombardment is because it was only fairly recently detected. So back in 2016, I believe it was, a German geological team realized that there's evidence that our planet underwent a multi-directional asteroid bombardment about 780,000 years ago, give or take a bit. And that these, at least about 3 or 4 objects impacted I think it's down in Tasmania, parts of Asia, and somewhere in the Americas, and that you had these objects. And the first thing you'd think is, would this be one object breaking up? Right, so some kind of meteor storm. But it turns out the chemical composition at these sites are different, indicating these are distinct objects hitting our planet at essentially the same time. So again, that's quite anomalous, that you'd have that kind of event occurring where different asteroids, large asteroids, are all impacting our planet at the same time. Very weird. Turns out that is happening at that time. And then also at approximately 780,000, in fact 788,000 is the best dated time, we have evidence of an object breaking up in orbit and raining down material, silica material, across Australasia, and in fact across about 30% of the Earth's surface. And that's called the Australite tektite, which I cover in quite more detail in my work. And that is an anomalous material for a number of reasons. I won't go too technical just yet, but just say that dates to the same period. And then the other thing, of course, that we're told in this book is that there is this genetic engineering. So when you look to see the human story, when does Homo sapiens really begin? Now, using different arguments for this. If you look at just say modern humans as we see them now, behaviorally and anatomically modern humans, they date to about 70,000 to 120,000 years ago. Now, if it's about the conventional story Homo sapiens, what we recognize as anatomically Homo sapiens currently is sort of 200,000 to 300,000. But if you ask, some of the leading experts at the moment as to when exactly does Homo sapiens really start to emerge, at this point, they're kind of going back to about 500,000 or more, because it's kind of clear that the basic precursor forms and the kind of the genes and the beginning of the large brain, all of that is already well underway before that. So, it's very difficult to use. I use the term Homo sapiens for these early beings, but at some point, maybe there need another term be needed, because a lot of people think of Homo sapiens as just as modern humans. But some of these more archaic ancestors, really, they also had large brains, right? So when do we trace back the beginnings of this large brain? Now, bear in mind, Neanderthals, Denisovans as well, they also had the large brain that we have. So when you trace these all back, they diverge around about 700 to 800,000 years ago in terms of the genetics. We know that these groups, the Denisovans, Neanderthals, and us, that we have a shared ancestor around about that time, 700 to 800,000 years ago. So something happens around then that leads to this emergence of several sort of subspecies of large-brained hominin, right? Which again is kind of funny, because for about 1 million years or so, Homo erectus doesn't seem to be doing very much and doesn't seem to have evolved very much. But then all of a sudden you've got this kind of split. And we can see in the genetics there are things going on there. That's the other thing. I believe that what really makes a human species, notable, is it the form? Well, the form follows the information. So to me, the species begins when the information for our large brain and our other characteristics, when that information arises. That's why I would place the beginnings of Homo sapiens at approximately 750 to 800,000 years ago, because that's when there are changes occurring in the DNA, and some of the changes are visible in the fossil record. You can look at a chart of the brain size of early hominins, and you can see that there is a sudden acceleration in brain size that occurs around about that time. And that's been known for long before we had the genetic data. It was known that there was something anomalous. And in the past, people have attempted to explain that by, were we cooking meat? Or, some people even suggested, was it because we ate hallucinogens? But there are a number of genetic changes that can also be seen in that brain case changes, right? So there's something incredible has happened then. And it turns out at that same point is when we have the split from multiple types of large-brained hominins coming out, whatever it was that happened. Now, there are some specific genes that appear. For example, you have ARGAP2B, which is quite a probably one of the better known brain genes. RGAP2B has a kind of an anomalous backstory. Now, there's two genes. I'm trying to think of the other one, but there's two of them that have really anomalous stories. One of them is maybe RGAP2B. One of them is known as having appeared from junk DNA. It basically seems to appear fully formed out of the non-coding or junk DNA. We know it's not junk now, but people might know it better as junk DNA. It's non-coding DNA. It doesn't code for genes. Basically, that suddenly this gene appears out of that information, and it's a crucial brain gene, right? And then there's another one, which is, again, for the, I think, neural cortex, which is described as appearing to be a snip, like a segment of a longer gene that they say is almost as though it's been, removed, copied, and put back in. And by having that duplicated small segment, it radically changed the neocortex. And so, when they describe it, they're saying almost like it was Xeroxed and put back in. So even in the language of the papers that talk about these genes, they are quite clearly shocked to see what they're seeing. That you've got segments, that look almost like they're cut and spliced segments, and others that appear fully formed out of this other code. Now, if you look across the genome, you also have chromosome 2, which is anomalous. Chromosome 2 is a chromosome made up of two ancestral chromosomes. We see in other primates that is fused, but not only is it fused, there's additional information and lost information at the fusion site, in contrast to all other primates. And we also find that it's fused on an active gene, a gene that's to do with reproduction, the brain, the immune system, key areas that you might want to get at, and that this fusion occurs around that same kind of time, around that 750,000 years. It occurs at the beginning of this split between Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. We know that because they all have chromosome 2 fused, right? So it's inheriting all three lines. There was a guy, a British biologist, who's kind of traced when it occurred as best as he can, as most accurate as he can. He came to set around 750,000 years ago. So again, we're in that same ballpark again of these events we're talking about. And this chromosome 2 has this anomalous effect. Because if you think about it, normally if a chromosome fuses, or if there's any kind of chromosomal error in humans, these can be really serious. It may lead to your death, but in most cases, it causes serious harm or can affect your reproductive chances, or even your fertility. Now, additional to that, even if somehow you didn't have any major problems from a chromosome error, right? Due to breeding with other people who will all essentially not have that, it will vanish again into the population. So, one person has a spontaneous error. If they have a partner, they manage to have children, it's unlikely, first of all, it'd be recessive, so it's unlikely carried on. But even then, if the children then marry and they marry someone else who won't have it, then very quickly these kind of mutations vanish again, right? Because there's no particular benefit. In fact, they're either neutral or harmful, right? But there's something different with chromosome 2, because instead of it just vanishing, it becomes absolutely universal to humans. There's a complete replacement. It's believed that all the other hominins at the time had this additional chromosome, and yet all of a sudden, well, quite quickly, there's a total global replacement where all these 48 chromosome humans essentially are replaced by these early ancestors of modern humans, and of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and that they replace all of the others. Now, for that to happen, there's three kind of considerations that are put in place by the experts in this field, saying that basically, first of all, this chromosome mutations probably would have had to have occurred in multiple individuals at the same time, which is unlikely, very unlikely. So you've got this strange mutation is now in multiple people in the same time and place, that these people have to be interbreeding. So it has to be a kind of a small disconnected community away from the main population of the time. And also that this chromosome fusion has to confer extraordinary benefits. Now, that starts sounding very strange. So we've got it's happening in some, isolated community of people in multiple individuals at once, and it gives them extraordinary benefits to the point that they outcompete all other hominids and it replaces everyone. Now, today, we might also factor in another consideration for anyone that's aware of genetic engineering that's occurring now, particularly if you look at what's called gene drive technology, because Bill Gates and co. are currently using this with mosquitoes. Some people might know this, that what you can do is not only modify an individual, but you can change them in such a way that, say, every female who interbreeds, that instead of passing on the information of both the mother and the father, one packet of information from each, which most children, of course, have, that it would overwrite. So the information. So if there was other species here, for example, if you coded a change in such a way as that it didn't matter who these new humans bred with, that all the children would be this new species. I mean, that's an intriguing possibility, because I think that would certainly have accelerated the removal of all other non-modified humans. But either way, something about this change is so profoundly important that other humans don't basically kind of survive this replacement event. There's just there's none of them that make it through. So it's either so extraordinarily beneficial, or there's something done where literally it's overwriting the other people. So this points to me to kind of lab work, that there's a small group of people isolated somewhere, like a lab, who all have a change at once because they are being changed, and that they have this amazing benefit because it's an upgrade. And then once they go out, then they go out and replace all of these other people. So chromosome 2 is absolutely, it's kind of I would say it's a kind of a smoking gun in itself. But then when you remember these genes that are appearing out of nowhere, or that appear to be cut and splices of longer genes, they start to build a bigger picture of what's happening. Now, the third angle for the genetics is what's called human accelerated regions. And these are, to me, perhaps the most profound and the most fascinating. And this is a fairly recent discovery, that when you look into areas of the genome that are not only non-coding DNA, but what's called kind of hyper-conserved or really hyper-conserved segments. And these are segments of code which have been almost unchanged for hundreds of thousands or millions or hundreds of millions of years, because they do something, fairly critical and fundamental to an organism, where there's almost no chance of it successfully mutating without it, basically in the sense of mutation, it's harmful, probably to the point of killing the organism or preventing it from reproducing. And so you can take different species. And there's the first one, HAR1, Human Accelerated Region 1, was compared across chimpanzees, humans, and chickens. Now, keep in mind, the chicken and the chimpanzee, they share an ancestor about 300 million years ago. So there's been a massive gap of time between these two species since they diverged, right? So if you look at HAR1, which is this short segment of code, it's 118 DNA letters long, if I've got it right. And it's either 112 or 118, but anyway, so it's a short segment of code. And so they contrasted these two species. And what they found is that in this 300 million years, 2 letters had changed, right? So roughly one successful mutation every 150 million years. So that's hella stable, right? Now, it's very interesting. If you look at, if aliens were to leave us a message in our DNA, where should we look? You'll find some articles on that. The basic consensus is we should look in hyper-conserved areas of non-coding DNA, and that's because of how stable they are. That if someone was to change our genes, that could be the evidence of that could be removed by the flow of evolution through natural selection and mutations, even though I don't think they play as big a role as we've traditionally thought, but that flow would erode signs of deliberate engineering. So instead, it's about, well, where we should look is in, particularly if it's a deliberate message, we should look in those areas of really hyper-conserved code. So funnily enough, that's exactly where we find these human accelerated regions. And as it stands today, there is no agreed solution for why these have occurred. Now, nobody is in the academic world is saying, ergo, it must be aliens. But what they did do is they ran the maths on this to see, what was the chances of occurring by any known means. And basically it came up as statistically as 0. So by any known mechanism of evolution, they couldn't find, there's no explanation for why we have these. Now, at this point, there are several hundred HARs. And the interesting thing is that that they kind of cluster. And again, if we're talking about random, remember, random mutations should be random, fairly random across the genome. So you expect these HARs to be doing all sorts of things. So far, what they have found is that the majority, the ones which are known, play a role in brain development, particularly fetal brain development. Now, go back to this idea that somebody has been engineering human fetuses, right, particularly to change the brain. And what you find is that there are a large number of these HARs which are to do with fetal brain development. So this is not sounding random. It's a clustering. And as it stands, you can look this up, and Scientific American and other magazines who talk about these topics. If you look to see what is it that makes humans unique out of the primate family, what differentiates us from all of the other hominins and the other primates. And right now, it's a kind of split between chromosome 2 and the HARs. So if you look, most of the kind of evolutionary biologists are actually looking at these two areas as being probably what was crucial to us being so different to the other primates, despite sharing, almost all of our code with them. There's very little on the surface, very little difference. I mean, if you look deeper into it, you'll see that there's a lot of replicated segments and stuff. So although people say, you were like 95% like a chimp, I mean, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, if you look at some of these duplications and stuff and deletions and stuff, then actually we're more different. But particularly if you look at the HARs and you look at the changes on chromosome 2, you start to understand that you don't necessarily need to, modify the code to such a degree that we're as different as a banana would be to a chimp or something. It only has to be in the right areas. Like, for example, the HARs, they mostly play a role in terms of genetic expression. So controlling how a gene expresses and how strongly it expresses. So you could change, say, if you have genes that are giving you the arm, you could change how they express. So that arm may be much smaller or much bigger, or, you do with the hands, you just change the formation of the hand to give us our opposable thumb, which again has been linked with an HAR. Now, so if you start to look at that, we have some very telling indications there of engineering. Now, the other interesting thing that I would suggest has been done is in terms of the retardation of our aging or of our growing process. And we are essentially frozen into a primate childhood. Now, this is called neoteny, which is the retention of infant traits into adulthood. So when you look at a human and a chimp, and you look at the literally photos, or you'd say, look, we look really different. A chimp has, this, this jutting jaw, and it's, big eye ridges and lots of hair and stuff. But look at an infant chimp and compare it with an infant human, right? And you find actually they're startlingly similar, because it's only later in their development that they produce these other features. And so we are essentially frozen into that stage. And we know this as well from things like the way that we have too many teeth in our jaw. That's because our jaw should move outwards with age. So we would have a jutting primate jaw, right? But we don't, because that never happened. Most people have too many teeth crammed into their jaw and have to have some removed, because we've got this neotenous trait. We are essentially like not far from a fetus that is frozen into place. And if you think about it, we're born as a fetus. Basically, we are not ready for the world when we're born. In fact, we have this really long infancy. And part of that is to get around a problem of an accelerating brain, right? So imagine you make a change in a fetus so that its brain is going to hyperdevelop, and you're going to have this enormous brain for our body size, which humans have. Now, most of those children are not going to be born alive. That the mother is likely to die as well, and the child's going to die because you've got to pass through the birth canal. So that's a major problem, to get this now burgeoning brain out of a human womb, right? So you've got this problem to travel down the birth canal. So how can you get around that? Well, if you can have the creature born still in a kind of a fetal stage, and it goes on to live almost as a fetus, has to have almost the same nutrition levels, and it has to be, with the mother continually, and it's able to walk, and it's essentially not much different from being in the womb. It's still developing at that rapid pace, almost the same pace initially, right? That you transfer some of that time to outside the womb. So that allows this head to grow at this rapid speed. But also there's other benefits to neoteny, because if you can keep a creature in that stage, infants have more neural flexibility and also are drawn to play and variation of tasks. So if you look at it, most species have a stage of play where the infants will play and then they specialize. So they may go on to only for the rest of their lives go and climb a tree, get one kind of nut, break that one kind of nut, give it to their children. They really don't do a lot once they're in their adulthood. But most of these species, as young, they have some sort of level of play, certainly mammals. Right, we are actually stuck in that stage. So if you look at adult humans, play is a big part of being an adult human, unlike most of the species, right? It's an enormous part of it, everything from sports to gaming to the way we think and stuff, right? Because we are neotenous, we're stuck in this infancy. Now that has benefits because it also means we're really flexible. We can change our skills, our jobs, our thinking, our projects, because we are not frozen in as a specialized species. So this again is giving us a lot of neural dexterity. And so that is another benefit of this neotenous change. So we have multiple benefits from what's done there. And again, the loss, in fact, that we have the lack of the hair and all that. The loss of hair, again, is because, in an early stage, primates don't have a lot of hair. Again, these are traits that develop over time. So we don't develop our hair, we don't develop our big brow ridge, we don't develop the jaw, we don't get this frozen into one path with one kind of specialization. All of these things are to do with this being stuck in this, this infant stage. Also, there's a lot of problems in the world, I'd say, because, we are a childlike creature, right? So we have that going on as well. And that's coming out of some of these changes that have been done with our genes. So there's a range of different indicators there for the genetic engineering that was done. And the interesting thing again is that we see this is occurring at around the same time as both the asteroid bombardment, which is now dated geologically, and this rain of silica material from an object that was in orbit that was rained down across 30% of the world's surface, particularly across Australasia, and this genetics. So now we have these three major anomalous events that coincide in time, but also coincide with the claimed narrative that these people are saying came to them from this artifact. And this artifact happens to mesh precisely with the expectation of our scientists that these Bracewell Sentinel probes might be sitting on our planet somewhere. So we now have a really strange hand-in-glove fit between Western science and the expectations of our great thinkers. People are, obviously like Bracewell and others, and von Neumann and people who expected that, von Neumann machines, that these people kind of expect this. And it turns out that these objects are very likely here in the possession of early people like the Aboriginals, possibly others. And again, we touched on earlier that there's a lot of correlation with the Ark of the Covenant claims of an artifact that was kept in a box that could communicate with them, handheld sized artifacts that could communicate, that were provided by some kind of alien. I mean, I don't think this is the God creator of the universe, because clearly it lands on a hill and gives people these artifacts, right? So we have again a similar backstory to these artifacts. Also, I think to the Hopi tablets, which are said that have been left by the great Pahana brother from the sky, who leaves these artifacts at the beginning time, and again, a kind of a similar backstory. So I suspect that these objects have been left at different points around the world, and they function as essentially as Bracewell Sentinel probes that they can record and interact, and that they are probably distributed around different points on this planet, and that some of our lore and legends refer to these artifacts. So I'll pause there again. I know there's a lot of information there, so I'm going to pause for a second for your follow-ups.
Yeah, so this has been extremely fascinating. The question I was coming up with is, would the purpose of extraterrestrial intervention or creation / manipulation of the human DNA, could this be connected to the theory that we are those extraterrestrials from the future going back in time to fix something genetically because of the way things played out? Or what's your take on the the idea of maybe time travel playing into this, or simulation playing into the purpose for the genetic manipulation? Or do you feel that the purpose of it was to make humans, or whatever, if we are humans, is to make the people here on Earth more compatible with the beings in other realms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, again, any of this, or I suppose any scenario, could be fitted into the simulation hypothesis. I mean, that is broad enough that basically any kind of scenario could be that we're inside some sort of simulation. I mean, this could be that's the game. That the game is there's this story that we are produced by these aliens, and that there may not be anything out there. That this could just be a story, and that we've been given certain bits of evidence for it. But if this is some kind of simulation, there would be no reason to fill this galaxy with being for a start. There would be no need to do anything except throw a few bits of crashed spaceship here, some genetic changes programmed into the story, and for us to then just sort of solve this mystery and it to be part of a kind of, a live action role playing game. And I'm quite aware that that's one possibility. And then we may look up and think, well, there must be all these civilizations out there. But if this is a simulation, then in fact, all you'd need to have is either the evidence to suggest they were there, or one other species who are part of this story and that we will have some interaction with. But you could have the rest of the cosmos empty, because that's kind of a waste of programming, right? It's a waste of memory or of processing power, or do you know what I mean? So I'm quite aware that in a simulation scenario, we could well be in an empty cosmos, if anything, maybe one other species who, they play a role in this story, okay? In terms of the time travel aspect to it, I mean, the first thing is, with any kind of, say, wormhole travel, and it is inferred in this, that it's probably wormholes. There's a description in the original narrative of a kind of a gateway that this craft passes through from the Pleiades to come to Earth, which suggests to me some kind of wormhole travel. And if you talk to a lot of the indigenous people, both in Australia and elsewhere, their legends do suggest that they talk about beings that came through a hollowed out trunk, or went up a ladder, or a road in the sky. And there's all these kind of stories, particularly a serpent that goes through the sky and that they travel through, or a spider's web, a strand of web that comes down and connects us to the sky, right? So there's a lot of inference there that this is probably a wormhole that they've come through, and that our ancestors around the world have stories of what sounds like a wormhole opening and beings coming through. So now, if you're using wormhole travel, you're essentially also traveling in time by default, because you're bending the time-space continuum to travel, in a way faster than light. But you're not really breaking faster than light, because you're just bending those points together and traveling what would seem to be, we imagine, fairly instantaneously, right? So that is also a kind of time travel. Now, is there the possibility of such things as, say, for example, seeding this planet? So I believe the DNA is an advanced terraforming technology, right? Personally, that's my take, is that you can seed a world with a DNA-based organism, like a single-celled organism in a metallic seed shell, if you like, just fire them down, and then you leave, right, through your wormhole. Now, is it possible that you then bend time space and return to that world in its future, right? And it now has a biosphere. So if you imagine a civilization that is that far advanced, so it can seed a world and then bend time space, kind of go home, bend time space again, and come back here millions of years into our future, and those same original beings that seeded the world are still alive, right? And that they turn up again, they're like, great, Earth's ready, and that's kind of mind-bending. But I mean, when you start getting into that type of technology, the possibility does open up. There's a time travel element. Now, with the kind of the us are them, or could they be our kind of descendants coming back? Well, I mean, I suppose it's sort of possible. I guess that you do have to deal with a lot more. I think it gets into obviously some really complex problems with that. So my feeling would be it's probably not that, because it obviously opens up so many conundrums about, altering the past and altering their own future and the risks involved in that. That even if they were to think we want to solve a problem, by attempting to solve that problem, might they not eradicate themselves instead? I mean, it just like, so even if you could do it, it would, which I sort of doubtful, but if you could change your own past, I mean, it just seems so fraught with problems and unknowns that I don't know if any. I wonder if any civilization would want to do that. They wouldn't be like very nervous about attempting it. But I wouldn't say absolutely it couldn't be. But yeah, certainly I think the idea that they could time travel using wormhole technologies is there. But whether they could, go into their own past and modify it, or whether we are them, I'm sort of dubious on that. Certainly from this, I don't have any indications that we are them, but more that they have modified, a hominin species that was here already. Now, the origins of all life on this planet, I suspect to be from alien DNA that was seeded here. So you could argue that we are already alien in a way. Our life goes back to life from beyond, and that it may well be that some of those who seeded this planet are those who come here and interact. I mean, that's, again, is possible. So we could argue we have a relationship with them. And then on top of that, what they say in this contact event, in the original contact event, is that this is kind of interesting. It's kind of like this was a plan B. So they didn't really come to do that. So they came to essentially take over Earth, but in a negotiated handover of this planet from one group to another. That they are going to essentially colonize this planet, that this is a colony ship that's destroyed, and that these survivors, the few survivors, then do a plan B, which is to modify this hominin. And there's a couple of reasons why. So first of all, they can't survive here, right? And again, this is very down to earth stuff, which you don't often hear when people make up a story, for example, because what it tackles is that they can't really live here because the technology they use to colonize worlds is self-changes using genetic engineering technologies so that they are adapted to that world, right? So during the travel from their home to here, they've already begun this process, and so it's continuing when they're here in orbit. But by the point when this craft is destroyed by this other group, they haven't finished this. And so these beings are not able to survive here. Many of them are dying on the surface. They cannot cope with the air. They cannot cope with the radiation levels from our sun. They can't drink the water because of the different bacterians in it. So very mundane things, right? That, that they are not suited to this world. So they've been partially adapted, but they are dying off. And they realize they cannot survive long term here. Right, which actually makes a lot of sense. They're saying that if we went somewhere else, it's very likely we just land and live on the planet, right? And in fact, if you look now, NASA is talking about engineering our astronauts for other worlds, right? And that's already being discussed, that to genetically engineer them and to use, cybernetics and drugs and stuff, so that they could live on Mars and stuff. It's really unlikely that you can just land and be okay, right? So that's something we know we're going to do, or at least is planned to do if we survive that long. And then so these beings are doing that. So then they realize they can't live long term. So what they come to the conclusion of is instead, they can modify this existing hominin that is suited to this planet. They can change it to be more like them. But also there is a kind of a self-interested element, which is a kind of a very weird, if you like, consciousness element to this, because at least the claim is that they are able to transfer their consciousness upon death into another body. And now this is something that, if people are familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, that high lamas claim they do, right? Is that upon death, they choose their next incarnation, where they're going to go, the fetus they're going to go into, and they leave signs and portents of where to look for them. Like they'll say, look for a village where there's this rainbow, and look for this, there's the mountain in the background. And they go and find these people, and they do these tests, they get them to identify objects from their previous life. And this has been accepted in Tibetan Buddhism for a long time. So what they do, they go and they look for the tulpa, and and then they do these tests, and in many cases, the kid identifies, those are my glasses, that's my hat, and then starts reciting Tibetan Buddhist scrolls, like 4-year-old kids coming out with these lengthy renditions of Buddhist texts, which is totally mind-bending. So these beings are saying that they do the same thing. So they're engineering these bodies also as almost like a kind of a spacesuit for their consciousness, so they can go into some of these beings that they're engineering. So there's a twofold thing. And by utilizing these bodies that they've made, they can continue this colonizing event. They also say that the other reason is because this planet is inhabited by a kind of a service to self, fairly kind of mostly unpleasant group, and is also in a sector of space inhabited mostly by negative beings. And so that's what they say, that this sector that Earth is in has many worlds of negative beings in it, and that they see this as providing an opportunity for the souls or the consciousness of these beings to incarnate into this human form and to use Earth as a kind of what I see as a cosmic rehab. And I know people about cosmic prison and all this, but as a kind of a cosmic rehab is the way it seems to be thought of, that souls can take the opportunity of taking a human body and living a life where they have the opportunity to move forward, that in their own forms, in their own negative worlds, that these beings have almost no chance of metaphysical kind of spiritual development. But in this world, they have this chance where they have this body that was being partially created by these negative beings, that they had a role in the backstory of the early hominins, but has then been modified by a kind of a service to others type species, and has been something additional, and they consider a light or something has been added by them doing this, that it gives an opportunity to these beings to progress. Now, again, I can't validate that by looking at genetics or creators. So there's nothing I can say that makes that true, but that is what they suggest is part of why they do this, that it continues this kind of plan to change this from being a dark planet to being a planet that is part of this kind of an alliance of more kind of networked service to others type beings and neutral type beings, rather than what it is had been, which was part of a network of very negative service to self type beings. This is kind of it's a bit like a cosmic crusade. Also, I suppose you might think almost as cosmic evangelism, right? That these beings are coming, they almost see it's like an opportunity to try and help bring some of these other beings out of their darkness and move them more towards a connected, collaborative cosmos, and that they see this project as offering a chance for that to happen. And I think that's kind of quite amazing. Obviously, I can't validate it, but then it does mesh with the experiences a lot of people have, when they say they interact with these beings or in their own lives, or looking across our planet, the strange range of very negative seeming people to very positive seeming people, very spiritually aware and stuff. So, if we do have negative aliens of many types, they're able to incarnate here and to play out their dramas in the hope that they will progress. Well, I mean, if you look at the horrors that are perpetrated by people that seem to have no morals or no regret to any of it, I mean, it would explain how some people sleep at night. I'd say that. And then conversely, why we see people with extraordinary gifts and extraordinary intuition and psychic abilities and stuff, people that say they remember lives as extraterrestrials. And so, obviously, the starseed phenomena, people say they remember being these beings. And indeed, if there were supposedly 50,000 on that ship who potentially all took incarnations here, I mean, that would give you immediately 50,000 people on this planet that would have a memory of being non-humans. But then over that time, many others have come. And so there's an unknown number of souls that have come in from other worlds. And then you get into this, obviously, the metaphysical side of this. And I'm very open to that. But at the same time, my focus has been on what I could substantiate with evidence, because, of course, the rest it goes into the, I guess, believe it or not, or take it if it resonates with you, which, I'm happy with in a way. But at the same time, you can find that almost anywhere in any of the kind of ancient aliens or UFO or metaphysical kind of stories, and in a lot of channelings and stuff. What I found was particularly different in this case was that, there was the physical evidence that backed up that there really had been an object in orbit that blew up. There really had been this bombardment event, and there really is indications of genetic engineering, and that the dating on them all corresponds to that period of roughly around 780,000 years ago, which by chance is extraordinary. You'd have these major events clustering, and on top of that, in fact, you have the last full geomagnetic pole shift is also dated to 780,000 years ago, so it's like a fourth major event. And I don't think that's separate, because if you look at one of the theories for why that pole shift happens is because of some of the objects that hit. There's indications of an object that was like kilometers across, potentially the size of the body that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs, the Chicxulub crater, and all, that they think that this thing went into the ice at that time. So one of these objects was massive, and it left a hole in the ice initially of 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers. So that's like almost like a planet killer kind of sized object. But the reason why it didn't cause the same level of devastation as the Chicxulub event is because it went into the ice, and at the same time that the planet was more frozen over at that time. So the ice absorbed a lot of the energy, a lot of the heat, and so instead of like tsunamis going out across the ice absorbed most of that, and obviously there's a lot of melted ice and everything, but it absorbed the energy. So that kind of, it didn't mean there wasn't a cataclysm, but the cataclysm was much reduced. And obviously some of these other objects, it's suspected there would have been major earthquakes, firestorms. So I mean, there definitely would have been a catastrophe with these objects hitting, but not to that same scale, even though one of them was, as I say, potentially was enormous, was like maybe miles across. Right. The other thing I didn't go into too much detail, of course, was the object in orbit. But I mean, that's a bit more lengthy and technical. I can tackle some of that, but very basically, if people want to look into this, I found in a number of NASA studies that australite tektite had a range of anomalies and mysteries associated with it. It's considered to this day a mystery topic, basically, in science, because they can't quite figure out how you end up with a strewn field, which is like a debris field that stretches for about 10,000 kilometers all the way from Southeast Asia down to Antarctica, right, and out into the oceans just as far as Madagascar and out beyond Papua New Guinea. This absolutely enormous debris field, right? Because if you have an impacting asteroid, and let's say it hits in Southeast Asia, which is where traditionally they thought this object, the causal object probably hit, that when something impacts, the material is basically thrown about 200 kilometers up to 400 kilometers from the site, right? So you can get a radius of debris of about 400 kilometers. Now, 10,000 kilometers is just wackadoodle-doo, totally off the scale. So they knew very early on that something strange has happened here to have that kind of debris field. Now, there's also a number of other problems. I don't want to go through too many. I'll give you a quick few, just a kind of a whistle stop of why this isn't just an asteroid. Because if you go away and you look up australite tektite, you'll see it as an asteroid impact glass. Now, I don't agree with that, but there's a number of reasons why. And now, the NASA studies back in the kind of the 40s, 50s, 60s, they went into a lot of this. There was a kind of debate for a long time between some NASA scientists and some other geologists over whether this material had a cosmic origin or a more terrestrial origin. And so what they point out is that there's a number of inconsistencies. For example, when an object impacts, the glass that's produced is almost identical to the material in the crater site, because obviously it's just melted rock from the crater site. Also, it's very foamy. It's full of bubbles because it's created a very fast, high energy event. So you just get a flash of intense heat and pressure. The glass is basically partly melted at the edges. You have pieces of stone lodged in it. You have lots of bubbles of air, gases frozen into it. It looks awfully like nuclear melt glass. They're very similar because they form in essentially the same kind of event, a kind of a big flash of heat and pressure. This tektite glass is not like that. It is much more like to volcanic glasses and human engineered glasses in that it's got almost no bubbles, and it's very well mixed. All of the chemicals in it have been very well mixed, which you see obviously in our glass and in calderas because they're heated for a long period and allows all the bubbles to leave and obviously the materials to mix, and you have this much fined glass, it's called. Now that's what you see with this tektite. They said, well, this is a problem because if it's forming in this instantaneous event, how does it end up well mixed and fined and without the bubbles? And in fact, almost no water almost 0% water, tiny fraction of water still in it, unlike Earth rocks, which have a fairly consistent amount of water in them. Also, you have the problem that if something of the magnitude that impacted, which is theorized, an enormous object, it would throw up a dust cloud, which would envelop the planet. And this is what is believed to have happened when the Chicxulub crater was formed, that this object threw up this enormous dust cloud. And we see that the iridium spike layer around the world. We get that the K2 barrier. You find this layer of dust is in the geological record for when it impacted, right? Because eventually that dust all falls down and forms a layer around the globe. Now, there's no indications of such a layer with the australite tektite. And even though microtectites have been retrieved from oceanic core samples, right? Despite that, in those oceanic core samples, there is no sign of that dust. There should be clearly in those same core samples, you should find that layer of dust with these microtectites, and yet there's no sign of it. So how could this object that's so powerful that can throw up all this material, how could it leave no dust layer? So that's a problem. Now, the exotic solution for how this material is spread is that perhaps this object, it manages to punch a hole in the atmosphere and creates a kind of a vacuum hole, right? So somewhere in Southeast Asia, and in it you have this like plasma storm scoring out the material, the surface, melting it, and it's thrown up, it's sucked up into space, and then it somehow is spread across this enormous area coming down from space, right, across this strewn field that stretches all the way down from Southeast Asia to Antarctica. Now, that's an exotic solution, which is obviously quite wild because you've got a number of problems with that. How does anything survive in this enormous vacuum hole, right, with these plasma storms going and stuff? Like, where's the extinction event for everything living in Southeast Asia, right? Also, when you look at the australite tektite buttons, and if people look into this, you find the tektite buttons were pointed out by NASA as being particularly a problem because they indicate having been cold spheres of glass in a vacuum, i.e. like in space. So already something has melted and has produced liquid, which is in a vacuum, forms spheres. As you see, water in a vacuum will become a spherical like droplet. So this material is formed in a vacuum and then has come down, bouncing along the edge of our atmosphere, and has come down at a very gentle angle and has had secondary melting on the front edge, and so that the liquid begins to run to the back. And you get this kind of a button shape or the nose cone shape, so a bit like the front of a rocket. And so they can see that it's formed with these aerodynamic shapes. But that doesn't happen if something comes in direct from space, for example, because it comes in so fast that what you have instead is the surface evaporates. So you get these. So when you get a small meteorite comes in, you don't see kind of this shaping, because what happens instead is just the surface liquefies and evaporates, and then you get just the inner part, the rock, hits the ground, and you see these kind of jagged, very poorly melted meteorites, right? So that's because they're coming in very fast and at usually a very steep angle. So instead, with the australite buttons, it's clear that they skipped along the edge of the atmosphere, and then they gently came in, and they said, this is a signature of something coming from a parent that has broken up in an orbital path. And so these are decaying orbital paths. So whatever this object was that broke up, it's already in orbit at the parent body. And then these pieces have followed that path, and they've begun to come in, and they've broken the atmosphere. And you find them some in Java and the rest down in southern Australia, but nowhere else in the strewn field, right? Which is, again, has to be explained because they're not all across it. The rest of the australite tektites have other forms, teardrops, dumbbells, discs, and spheres, right? And those are more signature of having formed within the atmosphere. So when you put two and two together, basically you've got chunks that are coming through the atmosphere and are exploding in aerial bursts. And these are creating these dumbbells, these discs and so. But the other pieces, the smaller pieces in space, they're coming down and forming these buttons. And so the NASA guys were kind of like, well, look, the evidence is really pointing to a large parent body that's in orbit. And that's why we have this extreme strewn field, because it's breaking up in orbit. and pieces are coming down all across that orbital path, all the way from Southeast Asia down to Australia, which we have, so Antarctica, of course, 10,000 kilometers. So there's no need for an impact. And the thing is, to date, no impact crater has been confirmed for the production of these tektites. A few sites have been proposed, none have been confirmed, and also it should be enormous. In that theory, it should be about the size of Ireland, right? Because to produce this kind of effect with this atmospheric hole and this vacuum storm and sucking all this material up, they're looking at an object like the size of the one that killed the dinosaurs. So this is going to be an enormous crater, very apparent, and very young at 780,000 years. Right, it's going to be very young. So where is this enormous crater? It should be about at least 40 kilometers diameter. Okay, the very lowest end I've seen proposed. So the massive, right? So a massive crater that should be very apparent. Right, so you have these problems. You have this that does not correspond with an impact and with material being thrown. It corresponds with something large breaking up. And what is it made of? It's made of over 70% silica. And no natural asteroids, meteorites, comets contain anything like that. The highest ever detected is like 60% silica. So you have an anomalous composition. You have an object that must be many kilometers across because it produced an unbelievable amount of this tektite material. It's already been exploded and is now remelting as it comes down. And that corresponds precisely with the description we have of this orbiting ship that is destroyed in space and that then... Okay. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep. I guess Ron has a question here.
Okay.
Yeah, I got a question for you, and then after that, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So, Scoobs, I see you. We'll get you up here in just a sec. And if you want to come up and ask Bruce a question, send a request. And if we get multiple speakers up, just put a hand up so we can kind of keep track of the order. So, Bruce, I know you maybe touched on this a little bit, but I was just wondering your thoughts on Atlantis. If, the technology of that civilization, like what you suspect might have been like, and anything about the inner Earth that you want to say about.
Yeah, I mean, well, with Atlantis, I always think it's a little bit of a loaded term because, there's a lot of stories that have been associated with a place called Atlantis. But I mean, I do think that, there was a civilization of some sort, that existed just before the Younger Dryas. Technologically, because we don't have any direct evidence of, we don't have much direct evidence of super high advanced technology. We have some evidence that, people could cut stone in an amazing way. They could stack stones very impressively. Yeah, I mean, I think that they would have had, like I say, a minimum something like the Roman civilization, but with some technologies that were different to ours and that could at least equal us in terms of cutting and manipulating stone and obviously creating concretes and things like that. So they had an unknown technology in terms of their megalithic building. And I think something that would be as impressive as anything we can do with our power tools. Now, I don't know if those were power tools, and if they were, I don't know how they were powered. Obviously, there's theories on earth energy or, pyramids providing some sort of electricity, but it's very theoretical. And obviously then others have said they may have had psychic powers that they used to do that. So I think it's kind of wide open. But I mean, I tend to see it as being a civilization that was, at least like the Romans. They had big ships, they could sail the world, that they had a complex civilization that was able to do major engineering projects, and that they had all of that. Now, I don't know where they were on the scale between Romans and us. That's the way I would look at it. I think in some areas they probably were more advanced or more forward thinking. They had ways of doing things that were, more impressive than how we would go about it. Maybe not using just brute force, electricity, powered machines. That they had more ingenious ways of doing things. But we just, it's really hard to know. I mean, I have seen at least some indication that maybe there was like a really advanced culture, and that's if you look at the stories from the Zoroastrians, that in one of their texts, they talk about this great winter where some of the people went underground, built this kind of survival, like bunker, and that they go down there. And it talks about having two kinds of lights. There's the kind of light that comes from the sun and from the moon. There's like a self-creating light which they can use under the ground. It sounds, a bit like light bulbs or something. There's some kind of lights that they have down in this complex, and also they talk about that every now and again they can replace the people by taking the seed of another man and woman, and basically kind of creating the next generation. So it sounds like an ark with genetic technology, and that they can take people, basically fetuses or something out of the freezer, and the next generation of people are created while they're all hiding from this great winter. Right now, is that just the writings of some weird person that just came up with this idea somehow? We can't know, but it sounds awfully like that they are talking about a modern technology, like a survival ark thing under the ground with genetic technologies and lights and stuff in it. So it may well be that is the case. There was an advanced culture, or that there are, again, many cultures like we have today. We have people in the jungle, they're living one way, people in the third world living another way, and then people in the developed world living in yet another way, right? So, it could have been there was something like that there was, a culture that had technologies, that there was a culture, a bit like the Romans, that were just sailing around, and that there were others who just lived in the jungles, and it wasn't that different to now. So if this small group of people had really high technology, it might explain why we don't find evidence of it, because it might just be in one area, one specific area, and we just haven't stumbled on that area.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I guess we'll go to Q&A now. So anybody wants to come ask a question, just come put your hand up. Please keep it brief though, because there's a lot of people and we have very limited time left. So Scoobs, what's up? You got a question?
Hey, good morning, Bruce and everyone else. So I got a couple of things to say and then a question as well. So at the start, when you were kind of talking about the Ark of the Convent, I just thought it was interesting that the Ark of the Convent is meant to be known to be made of the acacia wood. And the acacia wood, when you look at the meaning of that, the ancient Egyptians and Israelites, they said the sprig of the acacia primarily symbolizes the immortality of the soul when it is presented to a master mason. The evergreen quality of the tree reflects the human spirit, the immortal part of us, which can never die. And also I'm Australian, and the Australian national plant is acacia, and that was moving on to my next part of the acacia is high in DMT. So when you talk about aliens, I'm not quite sure if you've ever smoked DMT, but you can talk to the aliens there. And then even when you're talking about the meteorites hitting Earth, so like a meteorite hit 1.5 billion years ago, and we've got an auralite crystal. So this moves into the metaphysical side. So when you look into auralite, that's meant to help you raise your vibration to reach your higher self or those other aliens, etc. Same with then you've got moldavite. That was 15 million years ago. A meteorite hit there, and as you were talking about your strewn fields and whatnot. And moldavite is also meant to be the Holy Grail stone. If you go right back into all that kind of myths and mythologies and whatnot. And also I kind of wanted to add in, because I'm a bit of a self-proclaimed DMT wizard shaman, but I have an Aboriginal friend and I sent her some DMT, and it was about like a week after or a couple of weeks after I messaged her. I'm like, that kind of proves the dream time, right? Like, true. And she replied, yeah, I was pondering that last week and you're right. And then we had a bit of a laugh about it. And I think when you were talking about the reseeding of the Earth, Interstellar, that movie came into my mind when you were talking about, if they were going to reseed the Earth, could it end up just messing around with time, where you're kind of coming back in from the future back into the past and reseeding it? So Interstellar kind of has a movie a bit similar to that kind of story. But yeah, pretty much I just wanted to add those couple of comments and ask if you ever have tried DMT, if you were that much into aliens and thinking of talking to them, because that is definitely a way that works.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm aware of some of those things. Yeah, the acacia, yeah, very interesting as well, with the shamanic connection. Also, in parts of Southeast Asia, the acacia is seen as the tree of souls, where the different beings, like entities, gather there at night. Like, you should be careful of going to the acacia tree at night, because different spirit beings hang around the acacia and stuff like that. So it's got a lot of interesting lore. And like you said, with the DMT connection, being some kind of gateway to the other world, it makes a lot of sense now that we kind of understand that. So it's just really intriguing. And with the Moldavite stuff, I have some Moldavite. I argue actually that I don't go into any great depth about this yet, but that Moldavite I also strongly suspect is the remnants of a craft. Again, as with the Australite tektite, Moldavite is another tektite, and there's a lot of anomalies about that story. Again, Moldavite is formed without the bubbles and the mixing and all this. So there's a lot there to it. And obviously, when people hold Moldavite, a lot of the time they have a cosmic experience. They maybe see aliens, they see spaceships, they are in space, all sorts of stuff like that. And again, as you pointed out, it connects to the Ark of the Covenant. No, the Holy Grail. And in fact, there's a few different Grail legends, and in some of them, it's just a green, in some of them, it's the green cup, and in others, it's just a green stone. And then you've got like the emerald tablets, the idea that there's these tablets that, resonate psychic information to people, again, with that green gemstone. And so, I mean, there's a lot of overlap. I do think Moldavite, is that stone. I also think it is from a craft. I would say that all true tektites, I believe, are from exploded craft. So I think at this point there are 4 or 5 accepted tektite types on the planet. So all of them, I think, are from craft. And very quickly on that, I would also suggest people look up the Tunguska event, because one day I was thinking about that. I'd heard people say that Tunguska might have involved aliens, and so I looked up, Tunguska, crystal, glass, whatever, see if there was any connection. And weirdly enough, someone actually found a big chunk of a weird kind of crystalline glass at the Tunguska explosion site, and for years it was just kept in a fish tank. And they didn't know it was anything. And then when it was actually investigated, it turned out it's an unknown, anomalous, non-terrestrial kind of material that happened to fall in the site where whatever exploded over Tunguska occurred. So yet again, we have a connection between some sort of cosmic explosion of something above us and one of these kind of strange crystalline materials. So, I mean, I personally believe a lot of these craft are not metallic, that they are crystalline, they're silica. These are like living AI crafts. And so that's, I think it's quite intriguing. Then on the other point, I've tried ayahuasca. I smoked DMT, but not to the extent where I had I started a bit of a journey and I kind of pulled back a bit because it was like pretty hardcore, I'll be honest. I prefer ayahuasca because it's more of a gentle kind of journey, and I've traveled with ayahuasca a few times, certainly seen beings and all sorts of things that look like classical kind of demons and all sorts of stuff. So I mean, I can definitely empathize with that. I think that ayahuasca is a bit more gentle and obviously a longer journey, but not quite as like hardcore, just straight down the wormhole kind of thing. I appreciate that. Hopefully that was helpful.
I just wanted to say one more quick thing before I go. I forgot before, but when I was talking about the meteorites with your auralite and your moldavite, I was also going to say as a theory of potentially that's how they are seeding these planets. So that, they're, as you pointed out, rather than just having a nuclear bomb or laser, they throw a meteorite with their DNA upgrades, whatever they want to put into it, slam it into the earth and start seeding the world that way. I also then wanted to move that into with DMT or ayahuasca or mushrooms or psychedelics of the sort. Maybe that's how humans get their DNA upgrade naturally, not via like an mRNA Bill Gates metaverse type way. Also I'm going to have a look up at that Australite tektite. I haven't heard of that one before, but it does sound interesting. And I thought I'd just quickly add now that I'm sitting in my little pyramid with a grid of moldavite, a big, huge 1,733 gram auralite, and even some Libyan desert glass, colobanite, even some agnite, as you're talking about volcanic rocks as well. They all do very much help me, including with DMT, which, yes, it is very crazy, much more intense than ayahuasca, but it all helps me use that better and get more out of it as well. But yes, thank you very much. And the talk has been amazing. And thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So Bruce, I do have a question, or I did want to kind of get into the current times that we're in right now. I'm wondering, curious what your predictions are about like the direction of humanity. And it seems like some people are very pessimistic on what's going to happen. But what are your comments on like the Great Reset and what's happening right now? And kind of like there's this like revolution happening too. Mm-hmm. What are your advice for people to navigate these crazy times?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely in a paradigm shift. And paradigm shifts, if you look at historically and also at the entire theory of paradigm shifts by Thomas Kuhn and how he describes it, basically there's a cycle of change. And when you get to the point where the existing paradigm is being displaced because it no longer functions, then you get lots of competing kind of models. And in that, and in terms of if it's a social paradigm shift, which obviously we have as well as scientific shifts, those are often kind of bloody. And if you look like, say, the French Revolution or something, that societal paradigm shifts are chaotic and often bloody because you have competing interests. You have, humans that are invested in the old paradigm, others that are invested in the new paradigm. We also see in the sciences a similar thing, that in scientific paradigm shifts, although they're not normally bloody, they are full of biases and self-interest and money and people who've built their names on certain theories, right? So we have that happening in several areas of science at the moment, not least, obviously, we've talked about our origins, but it's happening in physics, it's happening in biology, in the story of evolution. We're seeing major paradigm shifts occurring across the board, and at the same time as a global sort of societal shift with the Great Reset and a recognition by the world controllers that things are going to change, and that they can either grab a hold of the reins and try and direct that change, or they will lose control, and these various competing new models will kind of eke it out for what's best for us in the future. And I think that's where we're at now, with competing models for the future. And it's going to be a case of, obviously humanity kind of choosing, and not everyone may choose the same. We may end up with more than one way of living, which is great, I think. If the technocrats have their way, they will have a unified, centralized, AI-driven global society with top-down control, with them living as a super uber class, living above us, and with their eye in the sky, space stations and satellites and all that, watching us, essentially farming us as cattle. I mean, that's basically their model. Is Earth is a big farm, with them as the farmers, and with them using all these technologies to control everything and to ration out the meager bit of resources that the animals on the farm are allowed. So, it's a really horrific model that, I think there's an argument for, would extinction be better? Probably. So, I mean, it's definitely not where we want to end up. So my view is I'm quite hopeful. I think that top-down control model will fracture and break. I think in some ways, even for the people doing it, that some of the people, as they start to, not necessarily the top level, but it takes a lot of other people in the next levels down, that as they start to realize what their children will have to live in, I think that they realize that the money ain't worth it. And they start to, that there's a point where you've got to think, what am I handing down to my children? So unless you actually are a psychopath, that, there's a point you've got to think your kids have to live in that farm. Right. So I actually think that's going to start to fracture and break more and more. We've already seen, unparalleled numbers of people recognizing that things have gone horribly wrong and are seeing through the propaganda. And that's the other thing, is the propaganda machine. If that breaks down, they just cannot do this change, and that's happening more and more, is that people are seeing the fake news, which is one thing I can credit Donald Trump for to some degree, is that, he did bring a lot of attention to the whole thing of fake news, which has now become, I think most people have started to realize that, the news is just propaganda. You don't have to be a Trump supporter to see that we have an enormous problem with the control of mainstream media by a few billionaires who are able to dictate essentially the story that we're supposed to all believe. And that's all breaking down. So I think that, there's the good opportunity to get out of that mess just by seeing through the propaganda. I mean, the whole thing cannot work without people accepting the media propaganda. It just does not work without that. So as that's falling apart, I see our chances improving. Where would we go from there? I mean, I think there's a couple of possibilities. We either become, more agrarian-like kind of simple living. A lot of people are drawn to that. The homestead and small communities, and or a kind of civilization that merges a bit of the technological with a more, let's say, spiritual, but I suppose a more humane way of living, where we might use technologies still in some areas of travel, or even in some hospital care, but that really rolled back in many other areas like data collection and control systems and surveillance, that rolling that back and just taking the best out of it and getting rid of the worst, and having a kind of blended society that is in some ways a lot more simple, but in other words may become radically more advanced technologically. That there may be that certain technologies locked up in archives in certain governments or the rest of it. If those systems collapse, we will essentially be going through the records of everything that's been hidden. We'll literally have teams of people going through and seeing, well, what's been hidden, and finding all of these energy technologies and the rest of it. So it could become something really like a hybrid of a more simple agrarian world and more in touch with nature and all that, but with unbelievable technologies like stuff that to power our world in a better way and all the rest of it. So I think that there's an unknown, but I do think I see something like that, maybe a blending of the two, but with some people really opting out of the technological lifestyle and having had enough of it and just wanting to form simple communities.
I guess we'll start to wrap it up here. I do want to be respectful of your time. So any last comments, Ron, Cosmic?
Nothing in particular. I just want to thank Bruce for coming out and spending 2 hours here with us and just really diving deep on some of this stuff. Super appreciate your time.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you also. I'm really excited to look more into your books and just kind of dig more into these topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm glad that you both found it interesting, and hopefully most people out there did. I mean, I know some of it's a bit of a monologue, but it's difficult for me to give an overview without a bit of a background monologue on how this project came about and what it covers, because there is a lot to it, and some of it is fairly technical, like necessarily technical. I mean, I know it's not for everybody, the discussion of how a tektite glass formed, or how it melted coming down. I get that for not everyone that's that interesting. It sounds interesting, but if you're going to make a case for an alien craft orbiting the Earth and breaking up, and wanting people to take that seriously, obviously I have to be able to tackle the the physics and the chemistry and stuff behind that, to not be just obviously dismissed by anyone with a scientific knowledge of those topics. So it's necessarily technical. It's always a difficult balance in these, to what degree to go into the the minute kind of scientific detail versus the story. And I think story is really important and really powerful, and that humans are shaped by story. We have a story of how we arose. Supposedly abiogenesis, crawling out of a rock pool, and all this, and evolving through random chance, and that's a story, right, with some evidence, but it's a story, and that has shaped who we are. Now, if we have another story that alien-seeded DNA, that we are being modified by beings, that there's all of it, that's another story with evidence as well. So we have competing stories with evidence, but they are both stories, most importantly. So I think we have to remember that stories make us and stories change us, and our whole culture and our way of life is based around stories. And even though they may have more or less evidence to some of them, that actually what matters most, I think, is the stories that we base ourselves on and our culture on. Because one of those is a story of basically slime beings crawling out of a mud pool and in a mechanistic universe with no real importance, and we're probably alone on this little rock. And the other one is that we are the cosmic beings with the cosmic relatives out there, and that have this intelligent DNA shaping us and sending us forward, and with upgrades. And one of those, I think, takes us into a much different headspace and a different kind of view of the world and of reality to the other. And I think that the shift to a new story is an important part of where we're going in this great reset, is that the old story told to us by the world controllers is one of, I think, a fatalistic, grey story that suits their minds. And it's not the story we should be basing our cultures around.
Yeah, well said. Thanks so much again for joining us tonight. There's so much to say about these topics, and there's so much more to explore. So we hope to have you on again sometime and kind of expand on some of the things you said. But thanks again.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. And thanks for all of you that have listened. Appreciate it. And again, if you want an article link or some evidence, they can always message me and I will send them something to look at.
Yeah, go check out some of Bruce's books, Exogenesis, and he's got a few others. So visit his page and check out that stuff. And we'll see you guys next time.